Great. So hopefully I am sharing my slides. So yes, as Stephanie said, today we're ensuring a reasonable representation of the evidence. Yep, there we go. The slides are moving. This is all going well. So the checklists that are relevant to this particular module are: have you specified the populations, interventions, comparisons, and outcomes? Have you avoided misleading representations and interpretations of the effects? And if you've used numbers to present the findings, have you used absolute numbers and labelled the numbers clearly? So just quickly to introduce us, although you might have seen us on our Flipgrid videos, Nuala and I are both associate editors in the editorial and methods team of the Central Executive, and we work with the review groups in these three particular review group networks. A large proportion of what we do is quality assurance. So we're looking at reviews before they're published in the Cochrane Library. And so our experience is largely with ensuring that a reasonable interpretation of the evidence is presented in the review itself, especially in the summary versions that will be highly accessed, such as the abstract. But the principles that we're going to be talking about today sort of apply to any dissemination product that you might be creating. So I'm going to hand over to Nuala, who's going to talk about common issues.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. So we're going to just talk through some of the most common issues that we see when people are reporting the results from reviews. So the first one that we very frequently see is, if we move on to the next slide. Here we go. So we'll frequently see this where someone has reported the review found the intervention leads to a large improvement in an outcome like pain. The problem is there is no mention here of the grade assessment. Therefore, we have no idea how certain this result is. At first glance, you look at the statement like that and you think that's a very impressive result. The intervention leads to a large improvement. But without knowing how certain we are about this evidence, we don't know what to do with it, really. Even when people do report the certainty of evidence, they'll sometimes do it later on in the paragraph or quite separate from the reporting of the results. And this isn't that much more helpful because by the time you get to the statement at the very end that the certainty of evidence was low, you've almost forgotten what the first statement was. Really, these two pieces of information have to be presented hand in hand, exactly one after the other. So low certainty evidence that the intervention leads to an improvement. It's really, really important that this information is always presented, but it's always presented together. Right. A second problem that we do see very frequently is people who focus too much on the statistical significance of a result. So a typical statement we might see is one that says, the treatment led to a statistically significant improvement in pain. But all this actually means is that saying that something is statistically significant just means the effect is unlikely to have occurred by chance. It doesn't actually tell you whether that improvement in pain was clinically significant or whether it was important to the individual experiencing the pain. So we're really trying to get people to stop focusing so much on statistical significance and instead focus on the clinical significance or the significance of this result to the patient itself. Another problem we do see frequently is when people don't explain the scales that they're using to report the results. So we have here a statement, there's a 2-point reduction in pain measured on the Hatifnit scale. But I have no idea what the scale is. I've never heard of it before. So I don't know whether this is a scale that goes from 1 point to 10 points, in which case, yeah, a 2-point reduction is a big result. Or could the scale go from 1 point to 100 points, in which case a 2-point reduction doesn't really seem to make that much of a difference. So if you're referring to scales when reporting results, you have to tell people a little bit about the scale, how big it is, and whether a high or a low score is a good thing or a bad thing. We also very frequently have a problem of people confusing evidence of no effect and no evidence of an effect. So this is a very typical statement we'll see. There is no evidence to support the intervention, but this is very ambiguous. We don't know what are people saying here, that they're we don't know that whether or not it works or not, or we know for a fact that it does not work. Really, the words no evidence, I feel like, should only be used whenever there is literally no data available. So there's no data available, then there was no evidence. But if there was data available, and if the data showed, then the data showed you very low certainty evidence, or the data was uncertain regarding this intervention, but saying no evidence is just too ambiguous and can lead to a lot of confusion. And the last problem I'm going to mention is one that people really do love to debate against, is this idea that Cochrane reviews should not formulate results as recommendations. So the aim of a Cochrane review is to provide the best available evidence, to provide a summary of that evidence and give an indication of the certainty of that evidence. It is not to recommend what people should actually do with that evidence. This is, in Messier, it's one of the reporting standards that authors must avoid making recommendations. There's a lot more detail about this in the handbook as well, where it explains how we cannot make recommendations because each recommendation will differ depending on the context. Just because we have evidence that, for example, we might have high certainty evidence that this intervention works, we can't say, therefore, it should be used, because we don't know what the clinical context is. We don't know what sort of resources that each district has available to them. We don't know what patient preference is like. So that's not our job as Cochrane reviewers. As Cochrane reviewers, the job is just to summarise the evidence and present it. It's not to recommend what to do with that evidence.
Brilliant, thank you, Nuala. Forgive me, but my slides are presenting on a different screen. So if I'm not looking at my webcam, it's because I'm trying to run slides on a different screen. So I'm not being rude. So we're going to talk about how we can use grade narrative statements to address some of those issues that Nuala just talked about. Okay, I think the slides are moving, this is good. When we're presenting the results of a Cochrane review to different audiences, we're trying to find a balance between giving a reasonably precise representation of the evidence on one hand and presenting information that's easy to understand on the other. And that can be quite challenging, as you've just discovered. So how can we tell people what the results of a review are in a way that they understand but doesn't simplify too much? So it goes back to the point that Nuala mentioned earlier, that to reflect the evidence accurately, you should always include information about the certainty of the evidence, and you should always present this information together with the information about the effect. And where do we find that information in Cochrane reviews? Well, in the summary findings tables, and these should always be your starting point when it comes to dissemination. So Grade have been working on a system for creating narrative statements based on summary findings tables for many years. And the latest version is in this paper that was published in JCE in 2020, led by Nancy Santesso. And a link to this paper is in the additional resources if you want to read more about the research that informed the development of this particular approach, which is a standard approach for creating narrative statements that are based on the size of the effect and the certainty of the evidence. This guidance is also included in chapter 15 of the handbook, a section of which was suggested as pre-reading for this particular module. And if you haven't had a chance to look at that yet, I'd recommend that you do so. The most important part is this particular table, which distills that grade, these grade statements. So this is table 15.6.b. And many people will be familiar with summary findings tables, but for those who are less familiar with them, I'm just going to briefly run through the structure of the table. So the table presents the most important outcomes from the review. So in this case, diarrhea, adverse events, etc. So this should help avoid the problem that Nuala talked about, where it comes to sort of picking which dissemination, which outcomes to include in your dissemination product. So not every outcome in the table will be relevant for your particular audience, but this should give you a good idea of what the important outcomes were in the review. The table also includes the absolute effects for the control group and for the intervention group. It reports the effect size, the number of studies and the number of participants, and also the quality of the evidence or the certainty of the evidence. So you'll see here this says quality of the evidence. In more recent review, that's been updated. So we talk about certainty of the evidence. They're interchangeable terms, but what we're talking about is the certainty of the evidence. So when you're creating narrative statements, the bits of the table that you really want to be focusing on are the outcomes, the absolute effects, and the certainty of the evidence. So how do we formulate a narrative statement? Well, we're going to use a grade matrix, and you look at the result for an outcome and you decide whether you think it's a large effect, a moderate effect, a small important effect, or a trivial, small, unimportant, or no effect at all. And then you want to look at the certainty of the evidence for that particular outcome. So is it high, moderate, low, or very low? And then the matrix gives us some suggested statements that we can use. So if there's high certainty evidence, you don't really need to modify your statement in any way. You can simply say, for example, that the intervention leads to a large reduction. It reduces the outcome, it reduces the outcome slightly, or it makes little or no difference. If there's moderate or low certainty evidence, then you're going to need to modify your statement in some way because we're less certain about the effect. And the guidance suggests using probably where we've got moderate certainty evidence, and may when we've got low certainty evidence. And when it comes to outcomes where the evidence is very low, it's a bit more straightforward. So that very low certainty evidence means we don't have much confidence in the results at all. And so you might not really want to focus too much on the actual result. But if you think your audience do need to know that result, you could use the wording for low certainty evidence. So for example, you could say that the intervention may reduce the outcome slightly, but then follow that with that the evidence is very uncertain. So they're the general principles. You might need to, or you will probably need to amend the wording to fit the review that you're working with, and particularly if you're writing in a language that isn't English. But remember that any amendments that you make or translations that you do should really follow these underlying principles, and you really need to have a consistent approach to how you're describing the effect and the certainty of the evidence. And you always need to give your readers some warning when the evidence is anything less than high certainty. So let's just run through this particular example. So this is a review on the effects of probiotics for children who are taking antibiotics. And when you give children antibiotics, they may often have stomach problems such as diarrhea. And one of the possible solutions is to give them probiotics while they're also taking the antibiotics. So what did this review find? So I've removed some of the columns from that summary findings table so we can just focus on the information that we're interested in, so the outcomes, the absolute effects, and the certainty. And looking at this first outcome instance of diarrhea, in the children who didn't take prebiotics, 191 out of 1,000 children got diarrhea when they were taking antibiotics. But in the intervention group, so those who were taking the probiotics at the same time, only 88 out of the 1,000 children actually got diarrhea. And so that seems like a pretty good result. And if you look at the confidence interval, the best case scenario is that 67 children got diarrhea, and the worst case scenario is that 116 got diarrhea. And that still seems pretty good, even though that worst case scenario still seems pretty good in comparison with the risk with the control group. So you need to make a decision about whether you think that that's a large effect, a moderate effect, a small but important effect, or that there's little or no effect here. And so for this example, let's say we agree that it's a moderately sized effect. And we can see that the certainty of the evidence is also moderate. And that means we can make the following statement, that fewer children probably got diarrhea. So the probably reflects that we're not completely certain because we've got moderate certainty evidence. If we thought that this was a large effect, for example, we could say something like probiotics greatly reduce the number of children who had diarrhea. For the next outcome, adverse events, the results show very little difference. So 35 children compared to 33 children. But the confidence interval for that result is pretty wide. And also the certainty of the evidence is very low. So here we might want to say, we don't know, or we're not sure what that probiotics have any side effects, because the evidence is very uncertain. And the final outcome, duration of diarrhea. The duration of diarrhea in children in the probiotics group was 0.6 days shorter than children who didn't get probiotics. Now, the problem with this information is that it doesn't say how long diarrhea usually lasts. So it is 0.6 days shorter than what? If we assume that the diarrhea lasts for, say, 3 days in children who didn't take probiotics, then in children who did take the prebiotics, then that's roughly half a day shorter. But the confidence interval shows a range of more than a day shorter to almost no difference. And that doesn't seem like a hugely important effect. So we could say there's little or no difference, and the certainty of the evidence is low. So here we can state that probiotics may make little or no difference to how long diarrhea lasts. And so the may here is referring to the fact that we only have low certainty evidence for this outcome. So taking all of those narrative statements together, we could say something like, the review shows that when children on antibiotics are given probiotic compared to no probiotics, fewer children probably get diarrhea. It may make little or no difference to how long that diarrhea lasts. And we don't know if it led to any side effects, because the evidence is very uncertain. So hopefully those statements are brief and pretty clear. If we wanted to, we felt that the audience we were talking to understood what the terms moderate certainty, low certainty meant, we could add those in particular if we wanted to be more specific. And for many readers, those kind of statements are probably going to be enough information. So for instance, if you were a parent and who has a child who's on antibiotics, it's likely to be enough that that fewer children probably get diarrhea when they use probiotics. But while words are more accessible, numbers are certainly more precise. And by presenting the numbers, it allows readers to make their own judgments about whether that effect is important to them or not. So ideally, we'd like to use both words and numbers, and that's really kind of quite important for particularly important outcomes. So for instance, if one of the outcomes we just looked at was death, then numbers would be incredibly useful and informative. So I'd say sort of, the more important the outcome, the more important it is for people to see the numbers so they can make their own judgments about the result. But the challenge here is going to be really difficult to incorporate numbers in a text that it's simple to understand. So, for example, we could include the absolute effects into the statement from before. So here we can add in, 9 children per 100 who were given probiotics had diarrhea compared to 19 children per 100 who didn't get the probiotics. And if we wanted to, we could also, refer to the confidence interval and say something like between 7 and 11 children given probiotics had diarrhea. But that would start to make this kind of what was originally a simple statement quite complicated. And this is just for one particular outcome. So if we're talking about, more than, multiple outcomes, the amount of information that when then communicating to people suddenly gets quite dense. So the amount of information that we choose to include involves making judgments. And we'll choose to present information differently to different audiences. So with that in mind, I'm just going to share a couple of examples of reviews that I've recently seen and worked on. So this first review is about interleukin-6 blocking agents for COVID-19. And this is an extract from the abstract, where you can see that the authors have used the narrative statements to describe the result for tocilizumab at day 28. And so they specified the length of follow-up for the outcome clinical improvement, and they used probably to reflect the moderate certainty of the evidence. And they described the relative effect at 1.06 as showing little or no increase. They've also reported the absolute effect. So here it's 31 more per 1,000 people experiencing clinical improvement. But information about the absolute effect in the control group is missing, so it's perhaps not as clear as it could be. How many people experienced clinical improvement who weren't taking this particular drug? However, the authors have given us a bit of a clue here, and they've said that there's little or no increase. So obviously they've arrived at the decision that 31 more per thousand isn't in their view a clinically meaningful effect. But because they've reported that information, at least we can sort of make some sort of judgment as to whether we agree with that or not. They've also taken a similar approach to reporting the outcome of mortality, so death, at day 28, and they've given a clear statement that it reduces mortality. And that reflects the high certainty of the evidence for this outcome. So obviously death is a really important outcome, and so they've also reported the absolute effect here, so 32 fewer deaths per thousand, and there might be as many as 52 fewer, or maybe 9 fewer deaths, and that's still an important difference. So the authors were limited by the amount of information that they could report in the abstract. But if you were summarising this review, for example, for different audiences in a different format and not constrained by the Cochrane library, you could maybe think about other ways of presenting these numbers, maybe in a table or some other sort of visual representation. So in the learning module, we've added a link to the Winton Centre's Real Risk tool. And this might be a fun thing to explore if you're looking at ways to sort of create visual summaries of data. This next one is an example of a complex review looking at diagnostic test accuracy of rapid point of care tests for COVID-19 or SARS infection. We've focused on disseminating findings of intervention reviews, but there might be times when you're faced with disseminating other review types. And in those situations, I'd really encourage you work closely with the authors and editors in the review group, because there are often very complex concepts to communicate. And for this particular review, the authors actually had participated in a press briefing with the Science Media Centre in the UK, so they could answer questions from journalists. One of the issues with this review is there's a lot of information in it, and this is a snapshot of about a fifth of what was the summary of findings table. So you can see there's a lot of numbers here. There were a lot, this is just a few of the actual tests that they looked at, but there are quite a considerable number of tests included in this review. So they selected the most accurate ones to present and summarize. But they've also given the results at various different prevalences of infection in the population. And they've also, we're reporting true positives, false negatives, true negatives. We've also got positive predictive values and negative predictive values here. So that's quite a lot of information to get across. And in the review, they did this in a very large table, but in different formats, how can we, communicate that? And so we made some decisions, or the authors made some decisions as well, I should say, about what to focus on. And we also took a slightly different approach in reporting the numbers depending on the audience. So in the abstract, 5% prevalence becomes, in the press briefing, 50 people per thousand with symptoms. And we use different ways of talking about the frequency of false positives and false negatives. So in the abstract, we were a bit more, the authors were a bit more technical in their description. And so we're describing between 1 in 10 and 1 in 6 positive results being a false positive. In the press briefing, that becomes between 5 and 9 positive results, test results turning out to be false positives. And just one final example is a review that the KT team supported with dissemination, and it's about the impact of stopping smoking on mental health outcomes. So when the review was published, it was featured on Cochrane.org, which gave a brief summary of the review findings. And so I helped draft some of that text. And I started by distilling what the grade narrative statements for each of the outcomes in the review into this kind of opening sentence. So the evidence will reassure people that stopping smoking will not worsen their mood and may improve their mental well-being by reducing anxiety, depression, and stress. But thankfully, somebody who, with fresher eyes than mine, because I've been looking at this review for quite a long time, pointed out that actually this sentence is a bit misleading. Because it makes it sound as if a person's mood is unaffected as soon as they stop smoking. But actually the studies in the review didn't measure outcomes until 6 weeks after people had stopped smoking. So people in the studies could have had a really stressful and difficult time for those 6 weeks. and I'd missed out really important information that would help people understand when the outcomes were measured. So in the final piece, the sentence specified the time point, and so hopefully this is much clearer for people and didn't give anybody any false expectations that as soon as they stop smoking, they'd feel brilliant. So hopefully that example kind of illustrates that it's really useful to get the views and thoughts of other people when you're working on creating statements, and it really improves the accuracy of your messaging. So just some take-home messages before we close, really. So always present the certainty alongside the effect. The summary of findings table is always where you should start. So for review authors and editors, ensuring the quality and consistency of the summary findings table is really, really important. And for disseminators, if there is something in the summary findings table that you don't understand, it's likely not your fault. Ask the authors or the review group if you're struggling to understand something, or if there's information that you don't have that you need to be able to understand the table. Developing narrative statements is not an exact science, and involves a lot of judgment. And we want to ensure that the underlying messages about the evidence are consistent across the dissemination products. But the wording that you can use will sort of vary depending on the audience. And sort of finally, collaborating with others will really improve the accuracy of your summary statements. It's really, really useful, and hopefully that activity kind of underlined that point for you.